Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything and the host of this, the Dispatches from the Front podcast, where we take a look at news through a company culture lens. Today, I want to talk to you about a story from CNBC. Headline of the story: most companies face little risk of punishment for taking PPP loans, legal experts say. Author of the story is Yu Sun. Public companies that took advantage of the government's small business loan program are likely to avoid repercussions from the agencies running the effort, according to legal experts. Businesses have until May 18th to return funds taken from the Paycheck Protection Program with amnesty, but most of the public companies that got PPP loans are keeping them, including ones with access to other forms of fundraising like stock sales or bank credit lines, according to a CNBC analysis of regulatory filings. That is despite a threat from Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin that borrowers face severe consequences and even criminal liability if they didn't really need the government money. Mnuchin's warning came at the height of an uproar last month over large companies using the PPP. Companies that could raise money elsewhere were given a deadline to return the funds. I want to be very clear, Mnuchin said in a CNBC interview on April 28th. It's the borrowers who have criminal liability if they made this certification, and it is not true. But lawyers advising corporate boards on their use of the PPP, a cornerstone of the $2 trillion CARES Act, passed in March in response to the coronavirus pandemic, said that the certification required is so vague and open-ended that most companies qualify for the program. I don't see anybody being convicted for this, honestly, said Scott Pearson, a partner of Manette, Phelps and Phillips. What will scare people away is the threat of being accused. The suggestion there is criminal liability for a company that has a good argument that they were eligible for these loans based on the structure of the CARES Act is ludicrous. Mnuchin's threat of criminal prosecution sowed confusion and anxiety among companies that had gotten funds and discouraged others from applying, said Pearson and other lawyers. People who knowingly make false statements to get PPP loans face up to 30 years in prison and a $1 million fine. The threat also succeeded in nudging some companies to return funds. As of May 15th, 62 loans totaling $412 million were returned out of the $1.3 billion that public companies received, according to data analytics firm Fact Squared. That was the point of Mnuchin's campaign, according to Matt Axelrod, a top aide to former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates during the Obama administration. Public companies that filled out their applications in good faith, met the legal criteria as detailed in the CARES Act, and used the funds for approved expenses like payroll don't have exposure to criminal charges, the former Justice Department official said. They're trying to use public shaming mechanisms to embarrass companies into giving money back that technically they're allowed to take under the program, said Axelrod, now a partner at the law firm Linklaters. A Treasury spokesman declined to respond to a question about whether companies face penalties for unjustifiably tapping PPP, instead pointing to Mnuchin's public comments and the Small Business Administration's guidance. At the heart of the matter is a one-sentence certification in the PPP application form that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. When the emergency program began in early April, businesses of all kinds were encouraged to avail themselves of forgivable loans to maintain workers they might otherwise lay off. Since most companies have been hurt by widespread shutdowns meant to blunt the progress of the coronavirus, this certification was seen as purposefully broad. Once news hit the large companies like Shake Shack got loans, while hundreds of thousands of small businesses were left in limbo, Mnuchin and the Small Business Administration worked to tighten controls on the effort, issuing new guidance that it was unlikely that public companies with substantial market value and access to capital markets could make the certification in good faith. As the program stretched into its sixth week, however, the agencies updated their guidance again, effectively backing off from their earlier threats. The SBA said on May 13th that PPP loans below $2 million would be assumed to have been made in good faith, clearing the vast majority of legitimate businesses from scrutiny. The move was ostensibly so the government could focus its resources on examining loans that were bigger than $2 million. But even in cases when an audit reveals that a borrower shouldn't have taken the loan, the SBA will simply ask for repayment of the money. If a company does that, the SBA said it will not pursue administrative enforcement or referrals to other agencies. That change lowers the risk even further that companies keeping PPP loans will have cases referred to the Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchange Commission, legal experts said. Still, companies may be vulnerable to whistleblowers who file lawsuits under the False Claims Act, used to combat companies that defraud the government, as well as actions of state attorneys general who may be looking to make a name for themselves, according to Ed Zimmerman of Lowenstein Sandler. Overall, the latest changes may give ammunition to critics who charge that the government is too lax in its oversight of this historic stimulus effort. Lawmakers and news outlets have pressed for a full list of companies that have tapped into the PPP. So far, only public companies have had to disclose their use of the program. When it comes to blatant criminal activity like fraudsters who fabricate employees or whole businesses, the Justice Department has said it is reviewing the data from the Small Business Administration and banks for anomalies in payroll information. Okay, that's enough. I read enough for you to get a flavor for what this is about. And it's simply this. There was immediate relief passed. They call it stimulus. It is not a stimulus. The purpose of it is not to trigger economic activity ostensibly to get us out of a recession or a depression. What the intent of it was to provide immediate relief to small companies, small businesses, so that they might be able to keep their employees on their rolls through this crisis. That was the intent of it. Now, in the justified haste to get it out, they made the rule very broad. And what has happened here is that companies that are larger and were not intended to be beneficiaries of this have not only exploited that loose wording of the intent of the law and taken those funds, but they've also crowded out relief for smaller business. It's often said, and it's very true, that the number one employer in America is small business. But that's not one company, obviously. There's no Small Business Inc. It's tons of small mom and pop shop kind of operations dotted across the fruited plain. And so what happens when a large company comes in, publicly traded, and instead of availing themselves of the various financial options that they have at their fingertips, instead, they decide to take this money intended to relieve small businesses for themselves. Number one, they take far more of it because their operations are larger than your typical mom and pop shop. And as a result, they crowd out many of these small operations. Because if you think about it, every one of these convenience stores, these small restaurants, these small retailers, not franchise, not chain, every one of these little stores has to file an application. So that means in the total volume of applications coming in, if you're the person from the SBA that has to review these, you've got 100 applications on your desk. Now you've got one that comes in from Conugco fraudulently, but covers, $3 million and 10,000 employees. Well, shoot. Since my work is done when the disbursement pool is gone, I can get there a lot faster with that one Conugco application than I can with 117 from all over Lafayette, Indiana, that I've got to pour over and approve. And even if I'm just hitting the click on it, that's a lot more effort on my part. So what do you think happened? They took care of those big requests first. And they found, you heard in the article, hundreds of millions of dollars has been given back, just the part that's been returned You can imagine how much of that money has been given out to companies it was not intended for. So we have conflicting values here. You have, on the one hand, the legislators who were trying to get relief and limit the damage from these lockdowns on small business, because small business, folks, is getting crushed. There is not going to be a middle class in the United States of America the longer this goes on. They cannot survive. And so legislators who were trying to stave off that disaster tried to rush the funds out and took it on good faith that it would not be there would not be widespread abuse. These large companies, for their part, were as spooked as the small companies by the economic disaster that was coming, and so felt they had the need to do everything they could for their employees and for their shareholders to keep the company going as a ongoing concern. Now, we talked a couple of podcasts ago about the value of integrity and how important it is, how often it shows up in the cultures of so many companies, how important it is to be honest. And part of that honesty, part of the price of that honesty, is to not take what's not intended for you. Should Congress have made the legislation clearer? Sure. Should the administration have made policy clearer? Sure. But you know whether or not your company by necessity requires these funds or not. Those companies which have exhausted their capital market options have a good case. Those companies which didn't even try to tap into those options have no case. They know what is right. And they ran to the trough like little piggies at lunchtime because they thought they could get away with it. And per this article, not enforcing the law, such as it is, but merely asking people to be honest, well, a number of those companies are flat out going to get away with it. But I think people should keep an eye on the companies that get named. And if you are a small business employee or owner who has to find another job because somebody else took up the funds that were heading your way to try to help you survive, then I would suggest you clip and save that list of the companies that have fraudulently taken this money and that you neither work there nor advise anybody else to. Because companies that do sleazy things, especially when there is so much suffering going on in this country right now, those are not companies you want to work for. If you have retirement funds or personal funds invested in such companies, you may want to make a list and divest as soon as you possibly can. Because a company leadership that will do dishonest things in order to make their numbers and their bonuses, that is not a company you want to have your money. Because you know that they will come first before you will as an investor. So it would be good to keep a list of those companies as they're exposed publicly and to get rid of your stake in them. Doing these things, drying up the talent pool and drying up the funding for these companies is the way to get them to change their behavior. It is the way to send a signal that it's not appreciated. If you think back to World War II, when we had so many factories that had to cut over to production for the government, previously making luxury sedans, now making Jeeps for a pittance. If they were profitable, they weren't very profitable. There were companies who resisted that sacrifice, who sought to devote their capacity to more profitable endeavors, as was their right being a company in a free society. But the blowback from the public that was making such sacrifices, sacrificing their sons, their daughters, sacrificing all the nice things in life, you couldn't even get nylon stockings, because that nylon was needed for things like parachutes. So women couldn't even get stockings during much of the war. You couldn't get meat. Everyone was on rationing because they were trying to save food capacity for the troops fighting overseas. Everybody was making sacrifices, and those that did not were resented by those who were, and rightly so. It comes down, as many of these things do, to a conflict of values. It's fine to value the survival of your company, to value your company thriving financially. That is natural, and that is good. To value it over the country as a whole, to value it over personal integrity, well, that's a different story. And so what we have in this story is that classic conflict of values. You have companies who are looking simply at their balance sheet and their bottom line, and are allowing that to crowd out their judgment. And in the end, I think they're going to find that those short-term decisions to compromise very important values will end up compromising their bottom line. Because at the end of the day, making your quarterly earnings, triggering your bonus is one thing, but culture is everything. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.